Welcome to Sustainable Sense, where we invest in climate defense. You're in for our hot take on all things money, markets, and the environment. So welcome to Sustainable Sense. Today we're honored to host Anushree Chaudhuri, a dedicated MIT student pursuing degrees in urban planning and economics. With a passion for driving systematic change, Anushree focuses on addressing the climate crisis and tackling structural inequities. So it's not something we've covered in our podcast so far. So her research with the Science Impact Collaborative expresses the crucial intersection of renewable energy, environmental justice, and community engagement. So Anushree epitomizes the interdisciplinary approach essential for crafting data-driven and human-centered policies and programs. So it's great to have you on the podcast today. So do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and what motivated you to pursue these degrees?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much for having me, Viva. So I'm currently finishing my master's in city planning degree, and I just completed my undergrad degrees in urban planning and economics. I came to MIT as a materials science and engineering major. I was really interested in doing clean tech research and attacking a lot of these issues from a technical perspective. And after coming here and getting involved with quite a few different policy and advocacy efforts, I realized that I wanted to continue drawing on my interests in writing, the humanities, and social sciences, as well as technical skills in spatial analysis and economics to bring more of this environmental policy focus into my studies and hopefully future career. So that's kind of how I switched to planning and economics as an undergrad here, which is a little bit unusual, but has been a fantastic experience. And I think planning helps you, envision and theorize, but then also do a lot of interesting case studies on, how things are and what they could be. And economics gives you a really valuable toolkit to ask empirical questions about policy interventions and hopefully answer them in a way that is realistic in policy systems. So it's been a really great way to combine two ways of thinking.
Yeah, it sounds great. So your work combines urban planning, economics, and environmental justice. So could you share how you integrate all three of these things to address the climate crises and structural inequities?
Yeah, so one thing that I think is really important is that, I think climate change, along with many local and global environmental challenges, will really only exacerbate existing injustices. And so I think taking this systems level way of thinking about these challenges as not just created by climate change, but as pre-existing and understanding the interactions with new challenges is super important. I think I've done a lot of mixed methods work in my research, trying to do some qualitative analysis, ethnography, interviews, focus groups, as well as quantitative work and econometric analysis. So that's been, at least methodologically, how I've tried to bridge both disciplines. And I think broadly also it's amazing to learn from very interdisciplinary debates in both areas. And then I think the other thing is academia is often very disconnected from communities and, of course, the private and public sector. So I think it's really important to engage in participatory work where you're collaborating directly with partners and both addressing needs and also learning from each other. So that's been really a core part of how I view my role as a researcher and hopefully in the future someone working in public service.
So how do you bridge those gaps between all of the academic research you've done and kind of connecting with those communities that you aim to help through your research? So how have you kind of bridged that gap?
Yeah, I think, a lot of my research with the MIT Renewable Energy Clinic has been pretty community focused. I spent some time in California, which is where I'm from, interviewing communities who are undergoing these ongoing conflicts about renewable energy projects and trying to understand how these disparate impacts, local spatial impacts, ecological impacts, economic impacts affect different socioeconomic groups and how we can develop a better process collaborating with private developers to distribute the benefits and burdens of these projects more evenly. So I think that research has been very much informed by community priorities. And I mean, my research questions changed a lot from when I started just because of what the communities I was working with wanted, and also being really attentive to this appropriation of traditional ecological knowledge, for example, when you're working with Indigenous partners, and also ensuring that, data ownership is something you're thinking about when you're working with communities who are a little bit skeptical of researchers coming in and taking data and not really giving it back. So those are all things that I think about.
Okay, so kind of connected to that, what would you say is the importance of this community engagement, and how did you navigate the challenges that you mentioned previously?
Yeah, I think, I think one of the big bottlenecks in large-scale renewable energy development, I'm most familiar with the US context right now, but in probably most contexts is a lot of lack of social and public acceptance. I think these projects are scary. There's often a big investor and a big developer that's not from the area coming in, using a really large amount of land and capital to develop a project that often doesn't even serve the energy needs of the population around it. Certainly a lot of these concerns get grouped into the acronym of NIMBY or NIMBYisms, that's not in my backyard. And it's often framed as this selfish response to new development in an area, often from like upper class, wealthier individuals who are worried about property values or aesthetics. But I think there are a lot of serious concerns about lack of transparency in the development process. Again, the distribution of benefits are often not even. These are often areas that have really high energy burden, high electricity rates. And so it can feel very unfair when the energy from this clean energy project isn't actually lowering that energy poverty in the area, and also often not providing that much long-term economic employment opportunities. So I think as we've hypothesized in the clinic, I think early and proactive consultation with community stakeholders can help inform some of that, so that developers aren't just saying, oh, well, I donate this much money to your local schools, if that's not actually what the community wants. So yes, very, very important, but certainly there's a lot of questions about how to do it right.
So do you think that engaging in conversations like one-on-one with the communities would help with that transparency, so they understand what kind of developments that are happening? So do you think that open communication is what is necessary in these cases?
I certainly think open communication is helpful. I think there's not so much empirical evidence about what works and what doesn't. A lot of this is so context specific and case by case. I think the clinic at MIT is currently focusing on having students work in teams to help communities mediate these conflicts. And so different things work better in different places. So sometimes when a developer reaches out early and tries to communicate about the project, that can go really well, and other times it kind of backfires and people are even more suspicious of the developer's intentions. So yeah, very much depends. I feel like I can't give an overarching answer.
Okay, that makes sense. So as a leader of the Student Sustainability Coalition, you've faced collective action on campus. So what strategies have you found the most effective in mobilizing diverse groups towards sustainable initiatives?
Yeah, for one, I think community building is really important, especially with advocacy where you're going to face a lot of setback. So I think often taking a step back and celebrating a small win, and also recognizing, even when different groups you're working with have a lot of differences, that you are united around some kind of shared mission. Those really helpful strategies. I also think as a leader, it's very important to try to empower others to take on roles and to give credit where it's due. So yeah, I think it's been really heartwarming to see like students who are first years step up into leadership roles and kind of carry the torch forward and bring so many new ideas. And so I think, making space is really important.
So what would you say are some of those small wins and memories that your team has accomplished and hope to look toward in the future?
Yeah, I think, my entry into this was through the climate action plan that MIT was publishing in 2021. And a lot of students organized around that to provide recommendations. And I think there were a lot of frustrating points where we received, a little bit of an antagonistic letter or email from an administrator. And I think those were often turning points in an important way, how we responded to those. Like if we had just seen those smaller points as points of rejection and stopped moving forward, the campaign would have fallen apart. And I think understanding like, at least they read our recommendations and took the time to respond to them. And there are points where we have some common ground. Let's celebrate that and then think about how to move forward in a strategic way. I think those were really important points. And yeah, I remember lots of moments of kind of bonding over how to respond to these things over Zoom that year.
So throughout your internships with environmental startups, NGOs like the Wildlife Fund, and other government agencies like the U.S. Department of Energy, what key lessons have you learned that you believe are essential for creating effective sustainability solutions, and how will they help you with your future visions?
I think I've been super grateful to work, at least experience a little bit of these different organizations, many of which are really large. So it's kind of hard to tell what they're like because every part is probably quite different. But I think, one thing from the US Department of Energy, I was very skeptical about working in a really large federal agency in how much one could get done. And certainly there were times when it was frustrating to hear about, how many levels of approval there were and how long it might take to get a meeting with a certain person who needed to sign off on some kind of funding arrangement before we could move forward. I was working on a funding opportunity, a building, it was called the Buildings Upgrade Prize for local governments and community organizations to apply to decarbonize their buildings. But at the same time, I was very surprised to see that this entire prize idea was coming from project managers, folks who were pretty young, coming with a lot of new ideas, and they were able to put together, this $22 million funding program. And even as an intern, I feel like I was given some level of ownership in shaping what that looked like. So I think there is a lot of power even in these large organizations to affect change if you kind of understand how to work within the structure and also outside of it.
So you mentioned that one funding program for the decarbonization of buildings. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what that encompasses?
Yeah, so I was interning at the Building Technologies Office, which is an office dedicated to advancing energy efficiency and other innovative technologies around buildings, residential, commercial, industrial. And so the Buildings Upgrade Prize was coming out of that. It is what it sounds like. It's kind of like a hackathon, but for like local governments. They have a couple months to apply with a plan to decarbonize their buildings. So for example, they might be working on insulation, weatherization, other kind of upgrades that take existing buildings and make them more energy efficient. And so that was, a project that was very much in full steam over the summer when I was interning there. So I was helping with creating a web application that would help local governments identify buildings that were in disadvantaged areas. And there was a portion of the prize that was following the Biden administration's Justice 40 initiative, which commits 40% of federal climate investments to whatever the federal government defines as a disadvantaged community. So I was kind of trying to incorporate those guidelines into the prize by creating this tool that would help local governments identify those buildings that would kind of fall into that 40% category. And yeah, it was just, we had like a stakeholder convening or workshop of sorts, and I got to hear from so many different people in the building decarbonization space. And it was a really fantastic learning experience for me, and cool to see a web app that I made on a .gov site.
That sounds great. So what are your plans as a Marshall Scholar, and could you explain what a Marshall Scholar is and how you achieved it?
Yeah, so I'll explain what it is first. It's one of several postgraduate fellowships that are available to, well, the Marshall specifically is only available to US citizens, but there's a number of other scholarships and fellowships that help support graduate studies, either in specific countries. For example, the Fulbright program supports studies or research or teaching in nearly every country. And there are other programs that are specific to a university. The Marshall is a fellowship that provides funding for graduate study for almost any degree at any university in the UK. And so I plan to pursue a PhD through the Marshall. So that's about 3 to 4 years in the UK, a bit shorter than in the US. And I'm planning to attend a program in geography or related fields, combining interests in environment, energy development, as well as, the disciplines of geography, economics, planning, the other humanities and social sciences. So that's the plan at the moment. And I'm still waiting to confirm which program I'll be attending.
And finally, what advice would you give to other students or individuals who are passionate about economics, sustainability, policy, and urban planning and want to make a meaningful impact in their diverse communities?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know if I'm able to provide any general advice, because I think all of the, things that you probably are doing already are really good starts. I think I found it really helpful both to become a better writer and thinker, to read a lot, not just, academic papers and articles, but to read stories, to listen to videos from communities around the world undergoing these challenges, to have conversations with people wherever I go, basically, about their lived experiences in an environment that often sparks so many new ideas and better understandings of challenges as well as opportunities in different contexts. And I think another thing that I'll say is it's been helpful to have a healthy level of skepticism also about many things I hear. You'll often hear about some, really well-funded new initiative that sounds really awesome, and then you look more deeply into it, and it's probably a mess internally, or it's really unclear what the intentions or, outcomes of the program will be. So I think bringing skepticism to analyzing any kind of policy, program, statement that someone makes, paper, can be really helpful, both in constantly, clarifying your own worldview, and also, being critical of the world around you.
So just to reiterate what you said, so taking the different perspectives and understanding each situation, not just from one side, but approaching it with a little bit of skepticism and seeing what different parties think about it, would that help with just overall coming up with the solution and coming up with those ideas that you talked about?
Yeah, I think that's probably a good thing to do regardless of what field you're in. But I think especially when you're thinking about making impact on some kind of problem, often I mean, coming from especially an elite institution, you're going to only get one side of that, or you might see like a certain policy solution is much better. And that may not be the case depending on your assumptions and perspectives you're considering. So yeah, just thinking about your positionality in all of the work you're doing.
Well, that concludes all of our questions. So thank you so much for your time, and good luck with all of your endeavors at MIT and your future plans in the UK.
Thank you so much for having me again.
Well, that's all for today's episode, and special thanks to Anushree for today's interview. So you can find us on LinkedIn and Instagram at Sustainable Sense Podcast. And if you have any questions or episode suggestions, feel free to email us at sustainablecentspodcast@gmail.com. That's sustainablecentspodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, this is your host signing off. And as always, invest your sense in climate defense.